let's talk about correlation. There are three different types of correlation that we're going to talk about. A positive correlation looks like a positive slope, where when we're going from left to right, our slope is increasing, which means that as one variable increases, the other variable increases. Then we have a negative correlation, which means that as we're reading the graph from left to right, it is going in a downward direction. That's because as one variable is increasing, the other variable is decreasing. And then we have what we call no correlation. And that's when we have all of our points are scattered all over the graph. And so they are not following any sort of pattern. Okay, so we use this when we are talking about questions about linear regression. Okay, so to be a little more specific, we have a couple of positive correlations and a couple of negative correlations, and we describe them a little more specifically using the word strong and the word weak. This middle part is our no correlation because, again, they're not following any sort of pattern. But as you can see in our first two correlation examples here, they are following in that positive direction. I could draw a line that was in between them, and that would be showing a positive slope. Whereas on the right side, I've got two graphs that are showing a negative correlation. Okay, this one's a little bit weaker because the points are more spread apart, and this one is strong because the points are more closely aligned to that line of best fit. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be analyzing the data points that are on graphs like this and then making connections and writing equations and answering some more questions. This is just a little screenshot of what you might see on your calculator screen when you're finding linear regression. And that correlation value is this R number. We have an R squared number, and then we have a just regular R number. That's the number we're going to be looking at when we're looking for our correlation coefficient. The closer that number is to +1 or -1, the stronger the relationship. So we have correlations on a scale from -1 to +1, with 0 being in the middle and a +0.5 being in between 0 and 1, with a -0.5 being between -1 and 0. Like we talked about before, this 0 is representing a weak correlation, whereas our -1 and our +1 are both representing strong correlations. It just so happens that one of them is a positive and one of them is a negative. So that means that our middle two numbers here with that 0.5 are representing what we call a moderate correlation. Okay, and that's because they're not super strong, but it's not totally weak. Now, we want to look and notice that these two numbers are our negatives and these two numbers are our positives, with 0 separating them in the middle. Let's take a look at a couple of examples and classify them according to their correlation. We want to use two words, the first being either positive, negative, or none, and our second word is either going to be strong, weak, or moderate. So looking at this first example, we would not be able to draw any sort of line in between them, so that would be no correlation. Feel free to pause the video and try the other examples, and then press play when you're done to check them. The second example, as you can see, is following a downward streak, which is negative. Because the points are not completely right up against the line, there's a little bit of movement in between them. We're going to call this a moderate correlation. It's still following that pattern, but the points are not tightly knit to that line. In example number 3, we can call this a positive slope because, as we can see, the numbers are going in that increasing direction. However, the points are kind of all over the place, so we're going to call this weak because we do have a couple of straggler points on the very outside that really are just not near that line. Let's look at the next examples. As you can see with number 4, that is going to be positive, and it's also going to be strong because all of those points are very tightly aligned to that line. Number 5 is going to be negative because we're going in that downward direction, and it's also going to be strong because the points are really close to that line of best fit. And number 6, we're going to call no correlation, and that's because they're going in a circular form. And so there's no connection, whether positive or negative, to those two variables. And lastly, we're going to take a look at some numbers. So as we mentioned before, the closer that it is to positive 1 or negative 1, the stronger it is. If it's really close to 0, that's weak. And if it's around that halfway point or leaning towards our 0, that's going to be our moderate. So let's take a look at some examples. R equals negative 0.89. That is going to be negative. So what I'm going to do is take a second and just go through and label whether they're negative or positive. I think that's the easiest way that we can just sort of start to identify, because we need those two words. If it has a negative sign in front of it, it's going to be negative. And if it has the positive, if there's no symbol in front of it, that's going to be a positive correlation. Okay, so now that all of my correlations have negative or positive, we're going to go back through and determine whether they are weak, strong, or moderate. Negative 0.89 is very close to negative 1, so that is going to be considered strong. 0.12 or 12/100ths is pretty close to that 0 mark in the middle, and that's going to be considered weak. 0.98 is very close to being 1 whole, so that is going to represent a strong correlation. The next example, 0.35, is going to be in the middle of weak and moderate, so I'm going to put a weak/moderate. And to be honest, most of the examples are going to be pretty clear about whether it's going to be weak or strong. Not too many examples show moderate relationship, but sometimes they do. In this next example, this is very weak because it's really close to 0. The next example is 0.61. That's going to be a moderate correlation because that's right around that halfway mark. Same thing with this 0.65, that's also showing a moderate relationship because it's hovering around that halfway. And you guessed it, we have one more that's moderate. Leaving us with 0.21, that is going to be a weak correlation because those numbers are closer to 0. So really quick, just to talk about what a correlation is, think about this. The more time you study for a test, the greater the chances are that you're going to have a higher test grade. So as the amount of time you spent increases, then the score on your test likely will increase as well. Whereas a negative correlation would be whereas one variable increases, for example, the amount of time that you spend scrolling on your phone, the other score will decrease, meaning your test score will be going down the more time you're spending on your phone. So that's just an example of a negative and a positive connection, which we're calling correlation.